All right. So welcome to the Uncolored podcast. I guess I call it podcast. I don't know what it is, but I'm Kevin Metcalf. Thank you very much. And as you can see already, I'm been graced with Eric Hernandez. I mentioned that he may be on the program in my last podcast, and he's been wonderful enough to come on the show. So rather than give me some of my knucklehead ideas, what I wanted to do is have people like our first guest here to come on and give you the real deal. Eric Hernandez is an apologist and a theologian. The guy's brilliant. What's your channel, Eric?
Eric Hernandez, just my name, Eric Hernandez. I'm not too
Eric
creative. Not a theologian, but I appreciate the compliment. Just
okay. Well,
just an apologist who's read some books and trying to do the work for the kingdom.
Okay. Well, apologist just as well. I came in contact with Eric, through a chain of folks. Tim Stratton mentioned that he has a free thinking, his website, free thinking. What is it? Free thinking Ministries. And he had mentioned that he went to Eric to help him with his ideas. And so I looked up Eric, and Eric is Eric is like the bouncer at the club, where he's just not letting stuff in. He doesn't get crazy, but we try to bring some junk in, Eric's like, no, man, you're not bringing that stuff in. Some of the debates that he's done are mind-blowing. They're sometimes incredibly informative if you can get two people on who are doing the same thing, but sometimes they're just really fun to listen to when you listen to some of the people he's talking to. So I'm going to let Eric introduce himself and explain to you some about, tell you who he is. And then we're going to get into some topics here. So thank you, Eric. I really appreciate you coming on. Why don't you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, I appreciate that. My name's Eric Hernandez, like you said, and I appreciate you doing this, having the channel. I think God's going to use you in this channel in a mighty way. I love your train of thought, your humility in all this, and the way you're approaching this. I think is just incredible. And thank you for that, and thank you for having me on. So I am the Apologetics Lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. Within Texas, churches affiliated with Texas Baptist, there's about 5,400 churches in Texas. So I get the privilege of being able to serve all of these churches and then some, and even outside the state of Texas. And tell me where you want to go with the interview. It's I'm totally fine wherever you want me to take it from here. I think you had mentioned how I got into apologetics. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, not only how you got into apologetics, but when did you become a Christian? What brought you to God?
Yeah. So great question. So I grew up in church, and I mean, honestly, I can be a Christian as long as I can remember. As I got older, without going into too many details, I began to have my own questions and some doubts. I mean, I remember being at like maybe 5 years old. I was young enough to where my feet didn't reach the floor in my parents' Suburban. And I remember, I forgot where we were driving, which I'm not the tallest person in the world, so that's not saying too much. But I remember driving and asking my mom in the back seat, I said, I don't understand the world. And she said, what do you mean? And I'm trying to articulate my thoughts as a kid. And I said, well, what was God doing before he created us? Was he by himself? Was he lonely? Was it dark? And she just kind of looked at me with the funny look. And I was essentially kind of asking what Leibniz asked, way before me, is why is there something rather than nothing? Right. So from a young age, I've always had these kind of questions, and just trying to understand these things. In youth group, I remember on a couple occasions getting in trouble with two of my youth pastors for asking questions. And what bothered me was, I'd hear all the time, invite your friends, next week or whatever. And I thought, why? Why would I invite friends that aren't saved when I, as a believer, can't myself ask questions? Right. So, and it wasn't all the time, but after hearing a couple of times, right, that I was just asking questions for the sake of being difficult or whatnot, when generally I wasn't. Now, granted, my personality can be a bit overwhelming at times, and I apologize for that ahead of time. But anyway, so fast forward. I remember one thing one of my youth leaders said. He said, if anyone asks you to prove to them that God exists, you can simply respond by saying, well, prove to me God does not exist. And at the time I thought, well, that's sharp. That's brilliant. I'm going to put that in my back pocket. If I ever need that, I'll pull that out. Freshman year of college rolls around and I'm signing up for electives, and being a freshman, and I had got a scholarship to go to college, to throw girls in the air. I got a scholarship for cheer. That's another long story.
That's
it's
the
a whole other
move.
long story. But so books and tuition paid for 2 years to do cheerleading. So I'm not taking things too seriously. I'll put it that way. And when I'm looking at electives, I'm really looking at what class can I pick that will let me skip, that I don't have to attend everyone. And when I looked at philosophy and read the description, in my mind, I thought philosophy was
that
just,
was it.
yeah, I thought it was just making stuff up and sharing your opinion. And I'm like, I can do that on my slave. This would be a class I can skip. So first week of class, my professor, he says, we're going to talk about something known as a burden of proof. And he said, what the burden of proof entails is that if you make a claim that something's true, or if you believe that something's true, you then bear the burden to prove the claim you just made. And then he said, as a random example, which I later found out this was not a random example because he was an atheist. He said, if you're a Christian here today and you claim that God exists, then you're making a claim and you now bear the burden to prove it. And if someone asks you to prove to them that God exists, you cannot respond by saying, prove to me he doesn't, because you're shifting the burden of proof inappropriately. And given that you made the claim, you must bear the burden. Okay. And when he said that, I felt like my house of cards collapsed. But I was intrigued. I enjoyed it. He was very even-handed. Later on, I found out he was an atheist, but I really enjoyed how he presented, both sides. And I was allowed to ask questions, which I thought was fantastic. So second semester rolls around and I want to take another philosophy class. And I remember everyone telling me that if you're going to take another philosophy class, do not take Professor Pena, because he's an atheist, he's antagonistic, he's condescending towards Christians and Christianity, and his goal is pretty much going to be to make you try and lose your faith. And that excited me. My response was really, well, where can I sign up? When does classes start? Because, call me crazy, but again, grew up in church, and, I was raised and I believe that all truth is grounded in God. So nothing that's true is going to contradict who he is if Christianity is true. So I knew that if Christianity is true, I needed to know why. But by the same token, if Christianity is false, I'd still like to know why it's false. And maybe this is a guy who, this is a guy for the job to show me. Well, there's lots of things I can say in that class that I learned. One of the pivotal days and classes for my life and ministry that really put me to where I'm at on this path where I am today. He walks into class one day and he pretends like he's holding up an antidepressant pill. And he says, now, religion wants us to believe in something like a soul. And according to Christianity, it's something immaterial. And this is where your emotions and your moods and your sensations, all these things are in your soul. And these are also supposed to be immaterial. But the problem is, he said, if I took this antidepressant pill, which is physical, how would it have the power to affect and change the alleged immaterial states of my soul? Because every time we look at the brain, all we see are neurons firing. And every time we look at the body, all we see are the, base elements of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and so forth. But no scientist has ever found a soul. And if the soul's immaterial, then how could it be that this physical pill, which is material, how can that change something immaterial? And he essentially said, well, the answer is simple. He said, here's how we explain this. The answer is that there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. You're just a physical brain and body. And we need to learn to live with this fact and get on with our lives and stop believing in, these foolish fairy tales. And it was pretty much like class dismissed. Right. Well, what really struck me was that at that point in my life, I had heard a lot of complaints against Christianity, but complaints don't prove that a view is false. Like, someone could complain they don't like how I talk or dress. That doesn't mean I don't exist. But here, for the first time, I heard an argument that, if true, would prove Christianity false. How so? Well, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christianity can't be true. And of course, I'm paraphrasing. So according to Paul in Scripture, if there's no resurrection, Christianity is false. And that's what I love about Christianity. It's testable, right? You can objectively verify whether or not this is true. But by the same line of logic, if there's no soul, well, there can be no resurrection. And by the same token, then Christianity would be false. So for the first time, I hear this argument, because I had never met anyone that didn't believe in the soul. I thought everybody did. And I never heard an argument given against it. So again, I thought, well, what do I do with this? I'm not the type to just brush something under the rug. And I like what he said in, I think it was like the first day of class. He said something like, we're going to talk about a lot of things that may offend you or upset you or go against your beliefs. And before Ben Shapiro, I ever heard Ben Shapiro say this, he essentially said something similar and said, truth and reality doesn't care about how you feel. It's going to be true, and it's going to be part of reality, whether you like it or not. And you can either, once you learn something that's true, that's gone against your beliefs, you can either change your beliefs or ignore it and keep believing what you now know to be false. Right. So when he said that, I remember thinking yes and amen. And when I was confronted with this, I thought to myself, well, I'm definitely not going to just ignore that. I want to know what to do with that. Now, I didn't think to go to my church and ask. I learned that question. I had learned that.
Was that because of your previous experiences asking hard questions about those things?
Yes. Yeah, I learned that lesson, to not do that. So essentially, really, I just thought, well, I would just really roll up my sleeves and kind of get my hands into some philosophy and study stuff for myself. I had no idea what apologetics was, but again, with this foundational belief that if something's true, it's not going to contradict God or who he is, well, then I shouldn't be afraid to learn anything. And there should be answers in response to these kind of things. So long story short, that's when I, heard about, guys like William Lane Craig. And then it was through listening to a lot of what William Lane Craig was doing. I heard about someone named J.P. Moreland, who today is my absolute favorite philosopher. Really? Yeah. And, he was an expert on the soul. So his stuff really, really helped with a lot of questions I had. And it just became one of those things that I just started absorbing and eating the stuff up and really trying to learn the ins and outs of this. Not so, and let me make this clear, not so I could go debate people. Right. Debate is a very small part of what apologetics can be. I often cringe when a pastor invites me to the stage and says, Eric Hernandez is a guy who debates atheists, because that's a very small part of what I do. Right. And not everybody's called to do it. That doesn't make me special because I feel that I'm called to do it or have a gift for it. Because that's not the goal, or that's not what apologetics is doesn't revolve around that.
Right.
So I learned these things because I had questions, and the greatest commandment, according to Christ, is to love God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength. That mind is your faculty, your intellect, your rationality. So I like how Morton once put it, whether you're lifting up your hands or lifting up a difficult book, you're fulfilling the greatest commandment and loving God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Right. So when I began to study this, again, it was for my own edification, for my own curiosity. And as I began to learn a lot of these things about God, his nature, I can't tell you how strengthened my faith was. And by faith, I mean my trust and confidence in who God was. I remember, through many points in studying this stuff, like the argument from contingency, for example, or the kalam, sitting back and thinking, wow, it's not just that God exists. It's logically impossible for God not to exist.
If I can cut in here, because when you're saying those things, that's exactly my feeling. Just again, over 5 years ago, I had a training officer when I first was on the PD. Sweetest guy in the world, but an atheist. And I remember we were talking about certain, God, not God, those kinds of things, and I really didn't have a lot of answers. And for many years, there were a lot of, my mom passing away, a lot of things that really I never didn't believe God didn't exist. But who he was and how our relationship was, there was just a lot of I didn't know. And just like you said, when I heard William Lane Craig do the first debate I heard with William Lane Craig and Sam Harris, the idea that you can engage with who God is intellectually, and it wasn't just an emotional thing or an experience that you had or a feeling or a song that you sang. When I started hearing these arguments, I'm like, it's just impossible that God isn't real. He has to be, if anything is to exist, just from the strength of these arguments. So I know exactly, I feel that same, or at least a similar way, that my understanding of who God was or is became unshakable because it's impossible that God doesn't exist, or it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you're using a deductive syllogism, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed. Right. So just learning these things, and I can go on for hours, but even learning some natural theology, learning that God is a maximally great being. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but
Yes.
it's not that God is just the greatest thing that exists. It's that he's the greatest thing that could possibly exist.
Yeah.
So if I go into let's say I go to a random store and I make a contest of who's the tallest person, someone's going to win. It won't be me, but someone's going to win. But once that person leaves the store, now another person wins by default. Right. Now contrast that with God being the maximal great being, the greatest conceivable being that you could possibly imagine. It's not that God wins being the great God by default because there's no other gods, but rather that he is the greatest conceivable being that could possibly exist.
Right.
Even if there were any other gods, of course, we know there's not. But I mean, just these conceptions of God really began to just strengthen my desire to learn more about God, my hunger for God, and even on another note, my heart for the lost, for people who were going to hell in a handbasket, if you will, with these horrible, bad objections and misconceptions about God. And you just think, and maybe that's where that no nonsense kind of attitude comes from. Because for me, I'm with you. I would, emotions are great. I think it was Norman Geisler said, emotions make life fun, but logic makes life safe.
That's right.
And, it had to be more than emotion if this thing was real. And I just didn't see a lot of that intellectual rigor, if you will, in my life. And adding to the story, about 5 years after I graduated from this community college, I ended up getting a bachelor's in theology. And to make the story short, this professor ended up being my very first public debate on the existence of God. So I actually ended up debating my former atheist professor. And again, that's a long story, but it was one of those things. If you've seen that movie, God's Not Dead, I don't like that movie. You're not missing out. It's not a good movie, but it was a similar story where, you have this kid who goes to college and then, has an atheist professor who tries to make him lose his faith, and he ends up debating the professor. And that's kind of where I got my feet wet, if you will. Again, there's a lot more details to it, but the first official one-on-one public debate was with him at a church I didn't even attend at the time. And there were around, including like an online audience, there were like 500 to 600 people that were watching that debate. And there were more atheists and Christians at church that night because of how influential this professor was. Right. And just from there, God continued to open doors, and, I just continued to learn and study. And, long story short, here we are today, where I now, for the past 4 years, have had a full-time position as an apologist. Before that, I was still doing apologetics, but I was quite frankly struggling to make ends meet, and just saying, God, if you want me to do this, you're going to have to throw me a bone here, because, I'm working 3, sometimes 4 jobs, cutting grass in the summer. And, I feel a call to do this, but I need your help here. And I get a text from Leighton Flowers, who's my boss. And,
is he?
Position. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Don't hold it against me. Yeah, he's my boss. But yeah, again,
love
another
Leighton
long
Flowers,
story, but
man.
yeah, it just a big Cinderella story of just getting to where I'm at. And from the beginning, though, my desire was always just to learn more about God, to know who he is in a more intimate way, and then to reach the people who are lost, who just don't know the God that I worship. And I want them to, because it's the greatest thing you can know and do.
That's such a wonderful story. It's amazing when I hear people's stories. It's fascinating for me to hear how people came to not only know God, but to do the particular things that they do. Because when I see what people are doing, I'm going, yeah, he's good at that. You were talking about J. Warner Wallace. J. Warner Wallace, I've seen him speak in churches a couple of times. And he's the kind of guy, and there are a couple of guys that you'll know in any profession. But when I was a cop, one of my sergeants, just a brilliant guy. And there are some people who are cops who are going, you're too smart for this job. And J. Warner Wallace seems like one of those guys who just are very brilliant, very analytical mind when I listen to him talk. So it's just amazing how it's encouraging for me, because again, you can see the world. I don't watch news. I haven't watched the news since 2009. But when you see some of the things that happen in the world, you can sometimes, I don't want to say get discouraged, but when I see people like William Lane Craig And one of my concerns there is like, listen, William Lane Craig's been doing this for like 30, 40 years. He's getting up there. What's going to happen now? And then I see people like you, and again, Tim Stratton and Leighton Flowers, and there's just so many young folks out there who are just, taking up the sword and going out in the battle every day. And it's just so encouraging for me to go, okay, yeah, this is the real thing, and we're going to win. It's exciting to listen to. So I really appreciate what you're doing out there. And I see you talk to, who's the guy? The guy looks like an old, rock and roll guy at Amun Ra or something like that.
Aaron Ra, yeah.
Aaron Ra. So if we could, I want to transition into some of the debates that you've had. The first, Aaron Ra. So he's an atheist and probably one of the more stronger atheists out there. Does anybody really take him seriously? Or is anybody, even in the atheist world, anybody go, yeah, this is the guy you got to listen to? Or is it just kind of I don't want to say a sideshow. I don't know the guy. I'm sure he's a nice guy, but I've seen him a couple of times and I could watch him for about 3 minutes and I'm like, okay, I've had enough.
Yeah. So good question. I mean, it depends who you ask, I suppose. When it comes to I'm the same with you. There's only some people I can stomach so much of, not just because I disagree with them, but just because, I mean, the level of quality and substance in what they're saying is so poor,
right?
And yet they have so much confidence. It's
right.
It's beyond me. But when it comes to the science, I hear he can be credible at times. Again, I don't watch his stuff. I tend to do more in the area of philosophy. Mm-hmm. But what I have found is, and I don't want to paint with the broad brush, let me say that first. But what I have found is he tends to be the kind of in your face, louder type of atheist who pulls out all the slogans and who says the things that it's almost like a gladiator match. People are cheering for this guy because, he, and I haven't watched much of his content, but yeah, the way he expresses himself and the way he calls Christianity a mental delusion and stuff like that. I mean, just ridiculous stuff that no serious scholar says.
Right.
But you get these internet Facebook atheists who love saying that, and you'll see them in the comment section. You'll see them in the comments on my video, and just saying dumb stuff that has no substance behind it. And I guess Aaron Ra is kind of like their poster boy, so to speak. And so in that end, he's quite popular. But that's also one of the reasons I agreed to debate him, because there's some debates I turn down. Right. But I also know that, and sometimes it's because a person just has no substance, or I'll say, well, let's have a private conversation, anything like that. But, when you have someone who has a following like him, sometimes people just need to be called out, quite frankly. Sometimes people just need to be, point out their flaws. And interestingly, without going into details about this, my first encounter that I had posted about with Aaron Ra was when you debated my friend Michael Jones, Inspiring Philosophy. And he asked Aaron a question, and he got really, I don't know did you see that by chance? Yeah,
you were in the audience and you came up and went to the mic and spoke to him. Was that the one you're talking about?
Yeah. Did you see my video on that?
Yes.
Yeah. So, he got kind of loud and yelled at me and pointed at me and whatever. So I made a video just kind of exposing, like, this is what the guy has to offer. And interestingly, I had people, people would send me screenshots of their friends messaging them and saying, wow, I didn't, why do I follow this guy still? And that definitely is part of the goal. And then we had our own, a couple debates interacting with him, but yeah, I think he has more confidence than he should.
Right.
Because I don't think he just understands a lot of these arguments or concepts. And I think he's just so stuck in his way that he digs his heels in, and some internet atheists on Facebook and YouTube like to see that kind of stuff. Right. And so do people take him seriously with regards to content? I don't know. I don't, especially when it comes to philosophy. With regards to how he portrays himself and the kind of show he puts on, I think a lot of people are attracted to that. And I think that's one of the things that kind of make him popular.
It reminds me of a WWF. That's kind of what it looks like when I see him.
Yep.
Now, what about Matt Dillahunty? I didn't even think of. This just popped into my head because I noticed you dealt with Matt Dillahunty again, And my impression of him is, while he's seems like a nice enough guy, when I think he identifies himself as a skeptic. Is that correct?
Yeah, skeptic, and then he uses a whole agnostic atheist kind of
Right.
nonsense. I would call nonsense, but yeah.
And I think that, to me, a skeptic is an atheist who's figured out that there's no good reason to not believe in God. And so they're just kind of taking a defensive position of, you can't convince me of anything, and that's enough for me. What do you think about that idea?
So yeah, he's interesting. He's much more sophisticated than Aaron Raw,
Right?
Which isn't hard to do.
Well,
And Matt has studied enough philosophy to be dangerous, if you will, especially if you're not familiar with the philosophy. Right. So within epistemology, the study of knowledge, there is a position known as skepticism, and there are different forms of skepticism. But the skeptic often puts the cart before the horse. So within epistemology, there are two main questions to ask. One is what it is that I know, and the second is how I know what I know or believe, however you want to phrase that.
Now, is that the ontology epistemology thing?
Not necessarily here. With here, we're talking, so within epistemology, it's study of knowledge and beliefs. Okay. And within epistemology, everybody has to answer two questions. What do I know? And how do I know what I know? Now, I'm what you would call in epistemology a particularist. I can start with items of knowledge. Well, I know I exist. Well, I know this, I know that, I know X, Y, and Z. And then I can come to find a way of a formula or method of how I came to know these things and how I can use that to know other things. The skeptic starts, or what's called the Methodist, not in terms of denomination, but within epistemology, there's a position known as Methodism. And the Methodist starts the opposite. He starts with the question, how can I know what I know? The problem with that is that it leads into an infinite regress. So again, without going into too many details of epistemology, if I say I know A, and the Methodist skeptic will ask, well, how do you know A? Because you always have to have a way to know how you know it. I say, okay, well, I know A because of B. Well, the next question is, how do you know B? Well, if you keep going back, it leads into an infinite regress. And the irony about this is that you can never know anything because there's never a stopping point. There's never a foundation to your beliefs. Right. So this is why you will hear Matt say things like, at one point, he told me personally that he's not so much interested in knowledge as he is in what he calls something like maximal justification. But basically, he might say things like, well, he doesn't even know if we can know anything, or if we can't know anything with certain. Another issue with the skeptic is oftentimes they hold to this view that knowledge requires certainty. Right. And so that's another area that he goes to, is that if you can't know something with certainty, you can't claim to know it. And if the possibility of doubt arises, well, then you can't have knowledge. But note too, by understanding the position from which one comes from philosophically, you can also know, and it will help you know how to maneuver a conversation or identify what tactic, if you will, that they're using, even if they're not intentionally trying to be manipulative. And I don't think Matt is necessarily, not for the most part. Of course, I can't read his mind. But for example, when you're talking to Matt, he may something like, well, how can you demonstrate this? He's essentially asking a question of Methodism. How do you know that? Whatever answer you give him, all he has to do is find some type of loophole or possibility of doubt. And in his mind, he's justified in rejecting whatever you say. So like, with the Kalam, go ahead.
Well, no, because I've heard him talk to a couple of people. There's also another kid named the Cosmic Skeptic, I think is his name. Mm-hmm. Okay. And they were having a conversation about, I guess the Cosmic Skeptic was big about, not killing animals, that kind of a thing. And they started going down this rabbit trail, and Matt was kind of like, okay. And it's almost like Matt's got this thing where, sure, I'll say yes to anything, but I've always got this trump card, this back door I can get out of, so I can say that, you haven't convinced me, kind of a thing. And to me, that seems like, again, not knowing much about any of this stuff, it seems like the laziest form of philosophy, if you ask me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad you brought that up. Because when I first was asked to debate Matt, because I think it was in 2015, I debated him on The Soul. I was a bit hesitant, not because I thought he had anything good to bring to the table, but just because he can be a slippery guy, intentional or not, I don't know. But it seems like the way he debates, I haven't seen him recently, but is more like in other words, if the debate is, does a soul exist? That's the debate topic. The debate topic is not, can I convince Matt Dillahunty if the soul exists?
And that's where he always goes to, is you can't convince me, therefore, I win, kind of a thing.
Right.
And I thought, well, I'm like, you can have that.
Exactly. Right. It doesn't make for an interesting debate.
It doesn't.
It doesn't go anywhere. And that's why, in our debate too, he had to cut me off on this point. But when I asked him that, and, he says, I don't know. My question was, well, what does that contribute to the conversation? And again, I was interrupted before I got to finish what I was saying, but it's like this. If, let's say you have a voting poll, yes or no. Well, if someone writes down on a piece of paper, I don't know, which box do they put that in? Well, they don't put that in anybody. There's no box for I don't know, because that doesn't help, one way or the other. So yeah, the whole knowledge requires certainty, or give me a mechanism, or can you demonstrate, or can you show me, or how do you know? Right. He's essentially when that keeps happening, he's essentially asking you to take a position of Methodism, which I don't even accept to begin with. So if I keep answering those questions, I'm essentially conceding his epistemological way of thinking, which I reject to begin with. So that's where it can become tricky with someone who's not familiar with these issues. And, again, all he has to do is throw some kind of, possibility of doubt or skepticism towards it. And, hey, I'm still not convinced. So, you don't win, so to speak. And he doesn't word it that way, but you get the point there. It's
just the easiest way to not believe in God without putting any effort into it, is what it seems to me. How about, and I don't remember his first name, but Mr. Smalley, whose radio program that you went on a few years ago?
Yeah, David Smalley. So one of the things that whenever I prepare for discussions or debates, especially with non-believers, one of the things I like to do is study their position and their tactics and their ways of trying to avoid an objection or argument. And he
seemed not to have a position. I hate to interrupt, but it's like 2 hours and 10 minutes. I got to 30 minutes. Like I couldn't get past 30 minutes. It was the funniest thing that I had ever heard, because he got to a point where, because you were using the argument against naturalism and evolution, I believe.
Evolution,
and how that makes your brain unreliable.
Yeah.
And he kept saying, he goes, well, I don't use my brain. We use experiments. And I thought, okay, he'll figure it out. But then just a few minutes later, he kept saying the same thing, and he couldn't get past that point. And when I hear that, I think, do you really hear? Do you know what you're saying? And I can hear the exasperation in your voice. And at 30 minutes, I go, I can't do this anymore. It was just too crazy. How did that go?
Yeah, so I think it went great. I really enjoyed it. I know that not too long after our discussion, I don't want to say anything, but you can take what you want with it. But sometime after our discussion, that episode was no longer available on this podcast. I won't interpret the news. I would just report it. So it was around that time I uploaded it onto my channel. So it's on my channel. You can watch Eric Hernandez versus David Smalley.
It's the best.
I really enjoyed it. It's worth listening all the way through, because we get into some other stuff.
Okay.
But it's in studying someone like Smalley, so he's not as sophisticated as Dillahunty, and there's different tactics he takes. And one of those tactics, it seems to be like, and a lot of atheists do this, when you study some of these tactics, you can kind of better know how to maneuver a conversation, or how to avoid something. One thing I noticed with Smalley was one of his tactics was just like showing this incredulity to whatever someone says. And I've noticed, like, he would have some relatively sharp people on his show, and they would give this great argument for the resurrection. And he may say something like, oh, but that just sounds ridiculous. And, your average apologist or Christian may say, well, no. And they'll try to go again. But see, I take what I call the lazy approach. I have a book hopefully coming out later this year where I explain what I call the lazy approach. But for me, if if your response is that's ridiculous, well, that's not a rebuttal. That's not an objection. So I'm not going to try again to explain it to you. That's a lot of work. I'm going to take the lazy approach and say, okay, explain what's ridiculous about it.
You did that a couple of times with, I think with Will Smith last night. And I thought that was brilliant. Yeah. Let them do the work. If they're going to tell you that it's a bad idea, then you need to tell me why. That's a brilliant approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, it's just a lazy approach, really. It's because a lot of times what I've seen in my experiences is atheists often, and this is not, I don't want to paint with a broad brush. I want to say that again, but a lot of times, especially online, you'll have atheists just make assertions. And then because they want to get a reaction out of you, and then you start debating or start defending, and all they have to do is keep making assertions, and they just sit back in their chair and just make these assertions. Well, remember, the burden of proof applies to anyone who makes a truth claim. So if, someone in my YouTube comments or even on Twitter or something says, oh, well, it's just ridiculous to believe in God because he doesn't exist, my response is not to provide evidence. My response is prove it, because you just made a truth claim. So prove it. And they might say, well, I don't have anything to prove. You're the one saying God exists. And I may say, well, I haven't said anything, but you just said that it's ridiculous to believe in God. He doesn't exist. Please prove your claim, or take it back, or take back your claim, or give me evidence for it. So, it's a no nonsense, lazy kind of approach. When Smalley says something like, oh, that's ridiculous, tell me why. What about it is ridiculous? Explain it to me. Help me see this. Because one, if we're both genuinely trying to understand the position, well, then maybe I am wrong, and show me where. But if you can't show me where, then I'm getting suspicious as to whether or not I'm wrong, or you just don't like the conclusion I'm getting at.
That leads me to another thought that I had. Again, when I watch these debates with atheists and Christians, especially with Dr. Craig, and I think Dr. Craig does it for a very specific reason. But the atheist side is always assumed to be true, and it's prove God exists, or how can morality be true without God, rather than prove God doesn't exist. You have to make a case for your side. Atheists don't ever seem to have to make a case for their side. And I think that what William Lane Craig in an interview once said was that he's not really there to convince the person that he's talking to. He's talking to the broader audience who may be persuaded by some of the evidence that he gives. And I understand that part of it, but sometimes I think, atheists have at least I haven't heard the positive reasons why God isn't real. Why is there never debate on that? Why don't they have to come up with a case for what they believe?
Yeah, good question. So this, a lot of times it's going to be dependent on who's debating, and like whenever I do debates, I'm particular with the titles of the debates, because you're exactly right. I want a title that's going to apply to both positions. So someone like Frank Turek, he prefers to debate the question, what best explains reality? Depending on who I'm debating, again, it depends on how I'm going to word the question. And again, it's going to be on a case by case, but right. This is why there's even one debate. It was, I think, the title I recommended, in which we ended up debating against Scholar Fiction. That was an interesting one. I'll put it that way. But the title was something like, "Are there any good reasons for or against God?"
See, that's bad.
Because he claimed to be an agnostic, and if he's truly an agnostic is someone who does not believe one way or the other. An agnostic doesn't believe there is no God, but an agnostic also doesn't believe there is a God. Right. So if you're genuinely agnostic, one question I like to ask people who claim to be agnostic, because we can maybe get into the definition later, is I like to ask, if you're agnostic, would you agree with me that there are no good reasons or arguments to believe that there is no God? In other words, an agnostic should be able to agree with me that there is no good arguments for atheism, right? Atheism, what is atheism? The belief there is no God. Now, here's where I've found in the past so many years, atheists have begun to try and redefine that word. Right. And that can make things a little bit slippier, which I think is just ridiculous as well. It's
such a scam. Is this the position where they go, I don't believe, I just don't have no beliefs, or something crazy like that?
Yeah, it depends who you talk to. They might say something like, well, I just lack belief in God.
Right.
And that's what makes them an atheist, which is traditionally not the definition of an atheist. And it just creates so many more problems to define things. And I have found it's essentially it seems more of a tactic as a way to avoid a burden of proof.
Right.
Because if you say, I'm not saying there is no God, I'm just saying I like belief in God. Well, then now you don't have a burden of proof. And now you can
don't
just
have a
sit
position
back.
to defend.
You sit back, be the skeptic, and just say, nope, I'm not convinced. Well, how do you know that? And how do you know that? And, kneel the clock, and then time's up, and, well, I'm not convinced, so I win. So
right. You turn into Matt
that's why.
Dillahunty. That's why I think that's just the laziest way to deal with the issue, is just say I'm a skeptic.
Yeah, and someone could genuinely be a skeptic, but here's my issue: if you're genuinely a skeptic or an agnostic, well, then don't debate, because you're not contributing to the conversation, unless you have something to contribute to the conversation.
Right.
Well, then don't debate. Keep your position, whatever that is, but you're not going to add much substance to a discussion or debate. So right. This is why sometimes I even leave definitions aside and just say, rather than say if atheism is true, sometimes I would just say, well, if God does not exist, then X, Y, and Z. Okay. Because at that point, I'm not, I'm going to leave the definitions aside. But yeah, I mean, that's a whole other issue that, again, when they try to redefine those words, it really is just nonsense, because they're
looking for a way out.
And some of them, to be fair, some of them truly believe that that's the definition, right. Because whether they're looking for a way out or not, it gives them a way out, and I think they like that about it.
Right.
But that's going to require them to define atheism in a peculiar way that no atheist scholar today defines it that way, right. And it's just really bizarre to me, because some will go as far as say, like Dillahunty will say, I'm an agnostic atheist, and a lot of them.
So they're stacking up the labels now.
Yes, which just makes it more confusing and ridiculous, because when it comes to the question of God's existence, we're talking about a person's beliefs.
Right.
Theism is the belief there is a God. Atheism is a belief there is no God. And agnosticism is a person who holds no belief one way or the other. Now, what they'll often try to do is appeal to the etymology, the root word of something. And for example, when it comes to atheism, I've heard atheists say, well, atheism is just atheism, atheos, without, and they'll say theism or theos. The original word is atheos, theos, belief in God. So they'll say, so atheism is without belief in God. That's not the etymology. The etymology, atheos, is without God.
Okay.
So to say atheism means without belief in God is adding to the word.
Sneaking a word in there.
Theos. Right, exactly. It's just without God. Right. But if you're going to say an atheist is someone who is without God, well, the devil's without God. The demons are without God. But are we going to say that demons and the devil are atheists? That just sounds ridiculous, right?
Right.
And they'll say, well, I don't know if God exists. Well, now we're switching from belief to knowledge. We're not talking about your knowledge. We're talking about your beliefs. That's where you start. So again, they'll try to redefine it, and then agnostic is without knowledge. So they'll say, that's why they'll stack the words. I'm an agnostic atheist. They might say, well, I don't think there's a God, but I can't say that I know there's no God. So they're agnostic atheists. Again, it doesn't work, because when you look at the etymology, an agnostic atheist is someone who is without knowledge about their belief there is no God. That doesn't make sense. Or someone who is without knowledge that they are without God. That doesn't make sense either. So it just muddies the definitions. It's ridiculous. It comes down to, do you believe there's a God? Do you believe there is no God? Or do you hold no belief one way or the other? I mean, it's really that simple.
Yeah, I've always found in anybody who's making those kinds of claims or getting so complicated, they're really looking for a way out. Listen, there's a battle to be joined, and either you want to be a part of it or you don't. And I think some people like to sit on the side and throw stuff in the ring. And to me, and again, not everybody, you don't want to paint with a broad brush, but yeah, when they start stacking up terms, and when I hear people like Matt Dillahunty, again, probably a nice guy, I don't want to defame the guy or anything, but I just think he just doesn't want to get involved, but he likes the status of being the guy. And if you take that position, they can't get touched. Who's that boxer that won like 50 fights? What is his name?
Mayweather?
Never getting hit. But he's like the boxer who's in the ring who just doesn't want to get hit. And you think, well, that's not something that's very interesting at all. So I have an idea about the problem of evil that I learned something new about. Now, as I understand the problem of evil, I don't really call it the problem of evil. I know there are things that happen that I don't like. But when I think of the problem of evil, I'm not talking about natural evil. I always talk about human evil. But when an atheist says, how can God be real if there's so much evil in the world? While I understand that on an emotional level, I understand that as not being a logical contradiction. As a matter of fact, I just, whose book I was just reading, I've been planning, I had an argument about that in the book I was just reading.
I'm gonna keep talking.
Okay.
I can hear in my headphones. I gotta grab something really quick, but I can still hear you. So keep going, please.
Okay. So while I understand that there's a logical problem, I mean, there's not a logical problem. It's more an emotional problem for an atheist. My thing is how can an atheist even ask the question or have a problem with evil in the world if their understanding is a naturalistic understanding that God doesn't exist? We came through evolution and those kinds of things. And there's just, like Dawkins said, just chance and randomness. And if you really think that that's the way the world is, then how can you even say something is evil? In other words, wouldn't the atheists have to define what evil is before they can even make an argument that it exists and that it says that explains or that proves God isn't real? Well, I said that real convoluted. It sounded better in my head. Does that make any sense? Oh, I think I lost Eric.
Yeah, no, I'm here.
Oh, there you go.
I had to grab something.
Okay.
Yeah, so depending on the person you're talking to is going to depend how you kind of flesh out where you go from here. Again, let me implement the lazy approach. Another shameless plug for the book that'll be coming out.
Lazy.
I had an atheist once say that his biggest problem in believing in God is that there's so much evil and suffering in the world. And I said, why is that a problem? So my first objective is to get them to unpack why this is a problem to begin with. And he said, well, because God's all loving. I said, yes. And he said, and evil exists. I said, yes. He said, that shouldn't be. I said, why? And he just said, well, because God's all loving. Yes. And evil exists. Yes.
Right.
Where's the problem? So, and at one point he even said, well, you know what I'm trying to say? And I said, maybe I do. I think I do. But if this is your biggest problem to belief in God, then you should be able to articulate the issue, the underlying problem with this.
Right.
And because, again, what do most Christians do when they hear this? They'll start trying to give a defense.
Right.
But what are you defending if there's no problem presented yet? It's like saying the sky is blue and the grass is green.
Right.
Okay. What's the problem with that? Right. There's some underlying assumptions for why it's a problem.
Right.
The second thing that I'll go, again, depending on who I'm talking to, is, I may get them to define evil or see whether or not if they believe evil exists. Because on the one hand, they could be saying, I don't believe evil exists, but if there's a loving God, why is there evil? That's a fair question to ask. But if they're atheists and say, I don't believe in God and there's evil, then I think now you have a problem of evil, but it's a problem for the atheist worldview.
Right.
And this is for a few reasons. I did a debate against Robert Stanley.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Please. Yeah.
Because I know you're going to give the smart answer. Let me give you the dumb answer first. And you tell me what you think. Because for me, if an atheist doesn't believe God is real and this is all evolution and chance, then the only real things that there are states of affairs that you wish would obtain, and then states of affairs that you wish would not obtain. But there's no evil in either one of them. It's just you either like this or you don't. And what you're saying is how could there be a God if things are happening that I don't like happening, is what it kind of comes down to. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, very much so. So absolutely. So there's two in the debate I did with Robert Stanley. Have you seen that debate by chance?
I have not.
Okay. So I give a case in there. And whenever I talk about this issue, my two main points, put it this way. First, you can look at something like the moral argument, because these could be 3 arguments or 2 arguments, depending on how much time you want to take. But the moral argument essentially is that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Now, why is that the case? Again, without going into all the details, if when it comes to morality, it's either going to be objective or subjective, if it exists. If it is objective, it is universally true and binding, independent of human thought or opinion. If it is subjective, then it's the opposite. It is going to be dependent on human thought of opinion, and then it becomes just a matter of preference. So,
but is it even morality at that point?
It's subjective. That's the qualification. It's a subjective morality, just like there are subjective truths, right? There are objective truths and subjective truths. A subjective truth is based on what I think. It's my preference. If I say Taco Bell is the best food, which is what I think, then that's subjective to me. It's not universal or binding to anyone. But if I say the number 2 is even, that is an objective truth that applies across the board, and it's always been true. In other words, it wouldn't make sense to say that one day scientists will discover that in 100 years from now, the number 2 will cease to be even. Or you can't ask, when did the number 2 begin to be even? Because this is an eternal necessary truth. So things that are necessarily true aren't dependent on our conception or agreement or consensus upon them. It doesn't depend on location. The number 2 is still even if you're on the other side of the galaxy. So subjective and objective. Now, if morality exists, I would say it's going to have to be objective. Otherwise, if it's objective, it has no binding to it. And then you might even get into something like moral nihilism, where there is no good or evil at all. Now, the problem is if something is objective, morally speaking, then it's going to have to be grounded in something that is going to be able to be eternal and transcendent and beyond us. Why? Because if morality is objective, it can't be grounded in us. Why not? Because we're contingent. The number 2 is even before we existed. It'll be even after we exist. When it comes to morality, same principle applies. So automatically, for there to be objective morality, you need something eternal, transcendent, beyond us. Sounds a lot like God. And then you can go into other features like moral values, moral truths. They have the properties of things like being loving or kind, loyal, justice. Now, these are all properties that belong to persons, not objects. So, and again, I'm giving you the short version. Then you would need something to ground it that's personal. And morality is also, ethics is a rational enterprise. So you need something that is rational, that is sentient. So you need something sentient, rational, eternal, necessary. And you can keep going down the list. And essentially, you're going to get to something like God. Because moral values and duties and judgments are unlike anything else. There's a law of mathematics, but I have no obligation to it.
Right.
There's a law of gravity, but I have no obligation to it. Right. Morality entails a notion of having obligations, but obligations are things that are owed to someone, not to something per se. Yeah, please.
May I interject here?
Yes.
That's how I came to this idea that if morality is not objective, then it can't exist. Because now all you have are these subjective standards that are not binding to anybody. And if it's not binding, even if I think it's wrong, again, in a world, an evolution will give an evolution and naturalism. It could be that the way the world is that whoever's stronger than the other person kills or dominates that person and takes their stuff. So I guess what I'm saying is, doesn't the idea of good and bad just disappear under that scenario, and it's just whatever is that makes it survive? I guess what I'm saying is, that's why when an atheist says, hey, how can there be a God with all this horrible stuff in the world, and they believe in naturalism and evolution, my question is well, what do you even call an evil? This just seems like you may not like it, but why should anybody else care if this is just some random, conglomeration of atoms doing stuff? So that's what I'm saying is I guess where I came to the idea that if morality is not objective, then what are we even talking about?
Yeah. Now, to I guess what the other side would probably say, and would be fair for the most part for them to say, is that, okay, there's nothing objectively binding, but we can have social conventions and say, and it'd be a subjective thing that we hold people to. So, for example, driving on the right side of the road or the left side of the road. There's nothing morally objective about that, but subjectively, as a society, we have agreed to these rules in order to get along, if you will, in order to have some type of order.
So I agree with that part, and I get that, but my question is, are we calling that morality or just something to help us get along? Because at the same time, you could also say that why should we even get along, right? Why shouldn't I just be able to drive where I want to? In other words, if there isn't this objective standard of what is right and what is wrong that is beyond us, it seems like whatever rule someone makes up that they like is okay. As long as they have the power to do it,
to enforce it,
that
right?
Makes sense.
Yeah,
So while we do make societies that get along, and that's great, I don't know that we can call that moral. We can just call that we get along.
Yeah, right. So what's interesting about these things is that once people when you start trying to defend subjective morality, you're going to have to eventually even appeal to something objective, because like you said, okay, we're making these rules to get along, but why is getting along a good thing to begin with? Right. So it almost becomes a circular question begging.
Right.
So the other thing, so we can say that you need a standard, you need something to ground morality, an objective standard, and that God is the only thing that'll fit that description. So we'll say that much. The next thing I like to do is to kind of, if I'm doing just talking about evil, if evil exists, there's at least two things you're going to have to assume in order for evil to exist. The first is an objective standard of morality or goodness, and the second is teleology to life in the natural world. So
you lost me on that one. You lost me on that one. What?
Teleology to life in the natural world, and we'll unpack that.
Oh, purpose to life.
That's one way of putting it. Yeah, we'll unpack teleology.
I'm a dumb guy, Eric. You can't be throwing around those big words here. You don't watch out now.
Yeah. So I'll put it this way, because because you don't want to question big, right? And teleology is a legitimate notion that. Well, let me set that on the shelf right now. So the first, an objective standard of goodness. When I say someone is lying, I am automatically assuming that there is a truth from which they are deviating.
Right.
So the existence of a lie automatically presupposes the existence of truth. Now, note, there can be truth without lies, but there cannot be lies without truth. I would say evil is the same way. There can if there is evil, then I am presupposing it is a deviation or a deprivation of a standard of goodness. So evil presupposes an objective standard of goodness, much like lies presuppose truth. Now, if there is
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that was brilliant. Dr. Craig says that when he says evil is a privation of good. And again, that's hard for my brain to pick up. But that idea that what did you say? Truth doesn't need the lie, but a lie needs truth. That's brilliant.
Right, to exist. Yeah,
that's a brilliant way to put it. Thanks for putting that.
I don't know if I came up with that or if I got that from Moreland. I'll have to go back and check. But
that was a good one. Yeah. I think Frank Turek has an idea. He says something about if you cut your finger, that's your finger's damaged. But if you remove the finger, you don't have the cut. But if you remove the cut, you still have the finger. Something like that.
Yeah. He also he has another one that shadows don't disprove the sunshine. Shadows need sunshine. So if there's shadows, then it requires the sunshine. You can have sunshine without shadows, but you can't have shadows without sunshine.
And just for the future, just for the future, those are the kind of examples I need. I need fingers, sunshine, stuff like that. This teleological thing, that's out of my league.
Well, yeah, we'll get to unpacking that next. So, so going back to so if there is evil, it's a deviation or deprivation from some standard or some goodness. Now, if there's no God, you can't have this. For some of the reasons we've already expressed, there's no objective standard. So we can really just modify the moral argument. And now the atheist has just given us a new premise. So going back to the moral argument, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But the atheist says, but wait a minute, evil exists. Well, if evil exists, now we have a third premise. Well, then objective moral values and duties exist. And the conclusion is the same. Therefore, God exists. So the irony is that in order for an atheist to say there is no God because of evil, he first has to presuppose God's existence in order to try and use evil to prove that he doesn't exist. Right. So when an atheist asks me, or when an atheist objects by saying evil exists, I almost tongue in cheek, have to say, well, wait a minute. If evil exists and it's a deprivation of good and good is grounded in God, then before I answer your question, are you still an atheist? Because you can't have evil if there's no God. And if there's no God, then nothing's evil. So which one is it? You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Right.
Yeah. So the second, now the teleology to life in the natural world. this is going to take a little bit more unpacking, but teleology is a notion that, like you were saying, it is a notion of a final cause, or we can use words like oughts or goals, end goals, or purposes, proper functions. So here's how I like to explain it. The first thing to explain would be the notion of teleology as it applies to evil. If I say I have a bad phone or an evil phone, this presupposes teleology. How so? Because I am implying that my phone is dysfunctional, that it is not doing something it should be doing, it ought to be doing. So ought, a proper function, and when you look at these, going back to the phone, this would assume that my phone's dysfunctional, but a dysfunctional phone assumes, and it is a deviation from a proper function, a way the phone ought to be functioning. Well, proper functions also assume some type of design plan, and a design plan assumes a designer. And in this case, for a phone, you're talking about, Apple, something like that. So dysfunctions presuppose proper function, and all this appeals to teleology. Now, going back to teleology, a final cause is for the sake of which something is being done. So the reason my phone has these buttons is for the sake of. So it's alluding to a proper function. It's alluding to an ought. It's alluding to teleology, the end goal or purpose of something. Now, if there's no God, you cannot have teleology to life in the natural world. Why not? So here's where we unpack proper function a little bit more. Final cause. Again, a final cause is the reason for which something is being done. So, for example, let's say if I were playing pool, we need to understand final cause. We can contrast this with what are called efficient causes. An efficient cause is merely the means by which something's done. So if I hit the 8-ball in the corner pocket, my final cause, my reason for which I hit the 8-ball in the corner pocket was to win the game. So my end goal and purpose was to win the game. That's the final cause. That's my ultimate end goal. And this requires teleology. It requires me to do things a certain way to reach that end or goal. Now, an efficient cause is merely the means by which something happens. So the 8-ball, the cue stick hitting the cue ball, hitting the 8-ball, and the laws of physics, yada, 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 make it go in there. But those are just efficient causes. There's no final reason for which. It's just an explanation of the mechanisms. Now, here's the catch. If there's no God, there's no teleology or final causes. Why? Because we are not evolving for the sake of something. Right. An atheist should agree with me that we are not designed. We are not evolving for the sake of reaching some end goal or purpose or some final cause. We are just changing. Now, let's relate this to evil. Let's say you have a child born with cancer or colorblind. They are born with a disease. By definition, a disease is a disorder of structure or function. So we can say, much like the phone, a disease is a dysfunction, but wait a minute, dysfunctions imply proper function. Proper function implies final cause, teleology, oughts, goals, and purpose. This implies a design plan to life, which implies a designer to life. So if evil exists and assumes teleology, and teleology assumes a design plan, and a design plan assumes a designer, then if there is evil in that sense in the world, then there must be a designer to life, namely God.
That's brilliant. You've got this written down someplace so I can read this again.
Yeah, in the opening of my presentation and my debate with Robert Stanley, I explained that, and then I explained that in the book that'll be coming out hopefully this year as well. What's the name of the book? We're going to promote it at the end of this thing, but I want to hear it. What you said? What was it called? The Lazy Approach? Well, that's the title of the approach I use. There's not an official name yet, so it's being published through Texas Baptist, but I haven't set on a title yet. I was talking to Greg Kokel and asking him about titles, and he recommended something that I'd like to use, if not the title, the subtitle, but something like The Lazy Approach to Evangelism. Yeah, he gets those creative titles like that. But yeah, in my debate with with Robert Stanley on
check
morality.
that out, because I've never heard that argument before, and it's interesting because the more I more I study this, the more arguments that you get for the existence of God that are just so powerful and so imaginative. Tim Stratton is not for the existence of God, but his free will argument, I just thought was brilliant. It's amazing how you young kids, you're out there, taking all these ideas and putting it. Do you do that idea math that the not the propositional math,
syllogisms?
Syllogisms.
Yeah. When I can, I do. And to not
That's crazy.
Inflate my ego. These are arguments I heard JP Moreland use. So I've just taken his arguments and just kind of worded them in my own way. But yeah, they are brilliant arguments. I just can't take the credit for it as much as I'd like to.
Well, still, it's I was emailing Joshua Rasmussen a couple of years ago, just questions that I had, and he goes, you should read Necessary Existence by Alex Proust. So I go, okay, sure. I pick up the book. I had like 13 pages in. I'm like, there's no way I can read this book. It's like a trigonometry thing. I don't know how you do that, but what's so wonderful about it is that's how I get I think, and you let me know, you understand this stuff. I think that what math is to the physical world, philosophy is to the world of ideas. That there's a very strict system to understand things. And again, if it doesn't work logically, I don't think you should really believe it. That's how it seems to me.
Absolutely, yeah. So math is actually a branch of philosophy. Interestingly, and yeah, the way I describe syllogism is like you take philosophy, analytic philosophy, and you take math and you put them together and you get syllogisms. And I'm not the sharpest on syllogisms. I know some of the basics of syllogisms, but they can get really, really complicated. Yeah.
There's a guy who's got a book. What's his name? He wrote a book. You're probably familiar with it. A Design Inference. Really brilliant guy. I have it around here somewhere.
Behe?
No, not Behe. It was one of the guys who works with Stephen Meyer. I wish I had his name. I'll think of it as soon as I get off of the thing here. But anyway, he's talking about how you can detect design, and he has this whole brilliant calculation for it. And in the first couple of chapters, he's using examples that I could understand. I'm thinking, this is going to be a great book. And then immediately it just starts stacking up these syllogisms with letters and symbols. I had to skip through until he got back to the examples. But I guess what I'm saying is that when I hear people talk about philosophy, and hopefully we have time to get to one of these things, I hear I've heard scientists do it, theologians do it, downplay philosophy and the importance of philosophy and understanding. I think it seems everything. And I think it's because whether it's a scientist or a theologian, they have this grand construction that they've made. And then once you start subjecting it to the light of logic and reason, it doesn't look so good. And rather than going, okay, I need to fix this, they go, let's get that philosophy out of here. It's just something over there. And again, it seems as strict and as strong and substantive as mathematics itself. It seems to me.
Sorry, I was muted there. Yeah. You like we were talking before the show, you can't do anything without philosophy. I mean, it's what undergirds everything. Just like you can't use language without having some understanding of grammar or putting sentences together and definitions and linguistics and meaning. Now, whether you can fully articulate that is a different question. But right. My son, who's 4, he's still learning how to put sentences together, but he's at least knows things about like syntax and semantics to an extent, even if he doesn't know it fully. So that's needed to have any kind of understanding, just like philosophy is needed for an understanding of anything. Now, in other words, philosophy is unavoidable. So the question is not, should we do philosophy? The question is, the philosophy that we're already doing, is it good philosophy or bad philosophy? And the person who rejects philosophy is typically the one doing bad philosophy.
It's amazing because right after, and there's another guy that I know and I really respect him, one wonderful guy, Kevin Thompson. he was talking. He's another one who's very staunch against Calvinism. And he says, instead of going to the scripture, you using, Satan's stuff, the philosophy, which is Satan's language. And I thought maybe he really doesn't mean that, because Kevin Thompson himself is a very philosophical thinker. And it's amazing how sometimes people will downplay or say something negative about philosophy when opposed to scripture or whatever discipline that they're in. And then they begin to philosophize about it. And I'm thinking maybe they don't understand it, or they're trying to say something different than what I'm hearing. I don't get it why people don't do that. If I could do it over again, or if I had anything to say about it, every school, every church, I don't care where it is, you'd have to know the basics of logic and reason. I think that would clear up so much nonsense if people just would scrutinize their own ideas, or at least when they're presented with a challenge to their worldview, they would know how to use logic to work it out, because maybe you do have to change some of what you believe. But maybe the challenge is nonsense, but it's just hard to know if you don't really understand the basics of logic and reason. That's why you guys impress me so much, because I hear you and Tim and all those guys, you get something and I'm like, wow, that is kind of a weird deal. And you just start breaking it down and you go, this is why it doesn't make sense. These are the strong points. These are the bad points. It's probably why it probably won't work. It's fantastic.
No, well, thank you. No, very much.
So tell me about the Unapologetic Conference. Who's going to be there, and what is it going to be? Dancing, singing? What are you guys going to be doing?
Yeah, that'd be a good note to end on. So we do, a part of my job with Texas Baptist is I organize 3 what we call the Unapologetic Evangelism Conferences, and what I aim to do is get at least 2 big name keynote speakers, who people know about, and then also have breakouts and use some local people for, specified topics. Like I like to do, when I do breakouts, I like to do mine on the soul, the existence of the soul. If we had other breakouts, like coming up, we'll have one of our guys, Ronnie Espinoli, in Orange, Texas, April 2nd. He'll be doing something on reaching Muslims. My colleague, Carlos Francis, will be doing something on Black woke identity cults, is what he titled it. Like Hebrew Israelites, Nation of Islam, things like that.
Oh, yeah. Is he the guy with the hat, with the channel? He does the black, is it the Black Israelites?
No, I think you're maybe thinking about Vocab Malone. There's other people who do that. But it'll be around those kind of topics. And then we have another one. That one's coming up in about a week and a half, April 2nd in Orange, Texas. Mm-hmm. Anyone can go to texasapologetics.org and you can see the list of the conferences we have coming up. September 17th, we'll be in Corpus Christi, and we'll have Mark Middleberg and Lee Strobel at that conference. Really looking forward to that. We'll have, for breakouts, we'll have guys like Kurt Jaros, who's a great guy, friend of mine, theologian, doing something on the reliability of the Gospels. Amy Davison from Mama Bear Apologetics. I don't know if you've heard of them. No. But on their book on, I forget the way it's worded, but it's something like a guide to culture and sexuality, something to that extent. Talking a lot about
what's her last name again?
Issues. Amy Davison.
Davison.
And Hillary Ferrer.
All the guys I know are guys, and I want to know some more gals who are doing this stuff too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hillary Davison, she's a founder of Mama Bear. Hillary Ferrer is a founder of Mama Bear Apologetics. Elizabeth Urbanetsky, I can never pronounce her name right. She has a ministry called Foundation Worldview. And she does great stuff, does curriculum for children with apologetics, stuff like that. So yeah, there's some good names of great women doing apologetics I can point you to. Our very own Katie McCoy did her dissertation on laws in the Old Testament about women and how it really shows God's justice, because you hear a lot of this accusations of misogyny and whatnot about that. So
I'm 57 years old. And I could see the change in the last 30 years or so coming and going. And I'm glad that I'm retired now and I can just sit back and do my thing. Because I'll tell you, I would have been kicked out of every organization or every club the way things are today. I don't know if there's too many places I could go anymore, especially here in California. It's insane. But I really appreciate what you guys are doing, because there's so much there's so many wonderful truths in the world that get hidden and you don't hear it anyplace. And folks like you that are getting that stuff out there, I really appreciate it. So can you tell folks where they can get the tickets to your unapologetic conference?
Yeah, like I said, texasapologetics.org. And they can go in there and they can see the conference, the list of speakers, their bios, the schedule, and any pastors, youth leaders, youth workers that want to come. We get pastors and youth pastors in for free, so they can just they can on our website, Texas Apologetics. There's a contact page. They can reach us there. We'd be happy to get anyone in. Any students who may be financially challenged and maybe can't pay it, or whatever the issue is, no questions asked. If anybody needs a free entrance, I'm more than happy to do that.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I'll tell you, you guys are the best. And I know you don't like this, but I can't tell you how encouraging it is. And I don't even have, I used to be a big sports guy. I was watching football, basketball all the time, watching a lot of movies, but again, everything's kind of changed and turned a little bit. And you can talk to my wife. I sit here on the YouTubes and listen to your guys' lectures and listen to your studies and listen to your debates. And it's not something that I do to study to learn. I just can't get enough of it. It's fascinating. So I really appreciate what you guys are doing. And I can't thank you enough for coming on with me in the program. And I would love to talk to more of the people that you're associated with, because I don't think this stuff could be out there enough, in my opinion. That's how I feel about it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And I appreciate that. It's an honor to be on. Thank you.
So, all right. Well, listen, thanks, Eric. Is there anything else you want to talk about? Anything else you wanted to promote before I close up? I've kept you for what, 2 hours, 2.5 hours already?
Yeah, no worries. I enjoyed it. In fact, just if it weren't for so Leighton and I will be doing something at 5, so in about 30 minutes. We'll be talking to a couple Calvinists online. So we'll be on some show. Anyone can go to. So one thing I didn't mention that I don't usually mention, but I don't mind mentioning it here, on my website, erichernandezministries.com. They can find stuff I've done. They can. There are some downloads you can purchase for like lectures I've done. Like I have like an 8-hour like a crash course in apologetics that I put together some time ago, and talks about a lot of this stuff. In fact, the arguments for morality, I unpack that a lot more in that little crash course there. But yeah, they can go there if they want like more content from what I'm doing aside from what's on YouTube. Some of that stuff, like you can see most of my debates on YouTube. But yeah, on that side, I'm mentioning like I recently did something on the soul that I was able to record and put out there on video that you can also purchase and download from there. So yeah.
Well, thank you again, and tell Leighton, because I'll tell you what, man, there's no harder working dude. I haven't seen his other stuff. But every time something pops up on Calvinism, I'm on there because he's so good at explaining these principles. And again, the first time I encountered it, it just seemed like nonsense to me. So I never really paid a lot of attention to it. But the way he goes through it, I think he represents both sides very well. To me, he's the pinnacle of trying to get to the source of something. And just let him know, I just, bumped into him a few months ago, and I'm one of his biggest fans. I'll be watching this stuff today. As a matter of fact, after dinner, I'll go out into the porch and have a brew and pull out a cigar, and I'm all into Leighton Flowers before I go to bed. I don't even know why. It's crazy.
That's good bedtime routine.
It is. It's just my routine now. So. Hey, thanks a lot, Eric. I really appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we can stay in contact and update me, because I'm coming out to Texas to one of your things. I got no reason not to, and I'm going to get my boys, or they're not here, my 2 dogs and my wife, and we're going to get in the truck and we're heading down to Texas.
Let's do it, man. I'd love to have you.
All right, thanks a lot, man. I'm going to click off now. All right.
Talk to you later, brother.
Take care, brother.
Yeah, bye.